That shit hypes me up every time. What's good, everybody? This is Ramiro from ANTICONQUISTA. ANTICONQUISTA is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And today we're talking about The National Question by Stalin. We're talking about one of the greatest revolutionaries of all time of socialist history, Joseph Stalin from Georgia, from the Soviet Union, who oversaw the fastest and largest industrial revolution up to his time. And today we're joined by comrades Nick Ayala, who's co-editor of Anticonquista, and Ernesto Ayala. They're not related, by the way. They just got the same last name. Comrade Ernesto Ayala, who's a militant of El Partido Nacional de la Raza Unida. Shout out to La Raza Unida, to everybody out there in Aslan. Ernesto is also on the team of Tele-Jaguar, a revolutionary Chicano media outlet. Please make sure to go and support Tele-Jaguar as well. How's it going out there, Ernesto? Doing all right?
Doing great, brother. And the clip just, it's beautiful. It pumped me up.
That's what's up, comrade. Yeah, me too. That always hypes me up. The International is a beautiful song, and we got to bring it back to our traditions as revolutionaries, as internationalists. Nick, how's it going out there in Jersey?
Pretty nice, man. Doing pretty well. I'm a little upset, though, we couldn't be together in person, have our hands held high and united,
Right. Yeah, the energy is amazing in that sort of setting, and it just shows the power of community, the power of being together, and the lyrics of the International. If you ever get a chance, for those watching and listening, check it out. It's beautiful lyrics. It's talking about the liberation of oppressed people, and it connects with what we're talking about today, the liberation of oppressed nationalities, the liberation of peoples who are under the boot of capitalism, of imperialism. And all of us here on the stream right now come from oppressed nationalities. Myself, my family's from Honduras. Comrade Nick, his family, he has Dominican and Puerto Rican roots. Comrade Ernesto Ayala, has Chicano, Mexican roots. And today we're going to be talking about national liberation, specifically Stalin and his writings and his foundational text on the importance of the national question. And so just to give you all some background on Stalin, he was the leader of the Soviet Union after the death of Lenin, who died, I believe, in the mid-1920s, 1925, if I'm not mistaken. And Stalin oversaw the Soviet Union as the head for the longest period, from the mid-1920s all the way up until his death in the mid-1950s. He oversaw the 1930s, the fastest industrialization of the Soviet Union, the fastest industrialization at that time in history, unparalleled anywhere else. And he also helped to organize the defeat of the Nazis, the fascists. He played a major role in defeating the fascist threat across the European continent. And he's somebody who comes from very humble roots. A lot of people mistake Stalin for being Russian, and Stalin is actually Georgian. There's a difference, right? Because Georgia at the time of the Soviet Union in its formation was an oppressed nation within the Russian Empire, right? You had the feudal Russian Empire that controlled Armenia, Georgia, Ukraine, and so many other oppressed nationalities in that region. Russia was the dominant nation at that time. And so not only was Stalin from an oppressed nationality as a Georgian in the highlands of Georgia, he was working class. He came from a one-room shack. His father was a cobbler, like his mom was a stay-at-home mom, came from very humble working class roots. And he eventually oversaw the development, the fastest industrial development in the world of the largest country and nation at that time, the Soviet Union. And so there's so much misinformation about Stalin out there, and we're hoping to clarify some of that by actually going to what Stalin says himself about national liberation, about the national question. And it's important to really review this for several reasons. One, because there's so much propaganda against Stalin, but we never actually get to hear from him directly and read what he has to say. And also, secondly, because nowadays within the left, there's so much discussion about the quote unquote white working class, about differences between the first world and the third world. And I think Conquista, we really believe in this idea that the most oppressed nations, the most oppressed peoples of the world, of Asia, Africa, Latin America, will lead the global revolution and have been leading it to this point. And this is what we're going to be talking about today, is the centrality of oppressed nationalities in the global socialist movement. And so that's just some very brief background on Stalin. I suggest you go and check out Stalin's Mustache. That's a great website that has some background information about Stalin. And there's a few other books. We can put some of the links later on. But before we go into actually reading some of the text, which we'll go over it, we'll read it, discuss it here together. By the way, shout out to everybody in the chat. Shout out to Black Star, Comrade Reeds, Volti. Shout out to everybody listening to this as a podcast. Shout out to Anticonquista, everybody who likes, follows, and shares our content. Before we get into actually reading some of what Stalin is saying about the national question, I just wanted to ask the comrades here, maybe we can start off with Comrade Nick, why you think it's important that we study Stalin's work and why the national question is such an important question to discuss.
Well, I think you touched on a lot of the most important topics. Stalin, in my opinion, is one of my favorite revolutionaries because I see it as he's a worker coming from a working class background who led the first worker state and successfully led the first worker state and defeated the imperialists 3 times. I remember watching this historian mention the 3 great defeats that Stalin delivered to the imperialists. He defeated them during the Russian Revolution, in order to establish the Bolsheviks in Russia. In the Soviet Union, he defeated the whites. The second one was the defeat of the Nazis. And then the third one was the defeat in terms of the space race, in terms of finally finishing what was the post-World War II Soviet Union, developing the Soviet state into the second largest economy, into a state which can easily compete with the United States and in the imperialist world. So, Stalin was, in my opinion, one of the first biggest and greatest threats to the capitalist world that stemmed from a socialist society. And he did it in such a humble way, in such a very humble fashion. If you read a lot of his work, his personal letters and writings, he's very, very humble. He never likes to take credit for things. He always tries to listen before he acts. That's not to say that Stalin hasn't made mistakes, but it's quite amazing when you have a leader so inspirational, so powerful, so intelligent, who's willing to actually do the work for the people. When you have leaders like that, it's no question why, you have the capitalist world spew all sorts of lies about them, about how many millions of people he killed, or how much repression there was in the Soviet Union. You have the craziest lies, I think, against Stalin that are only paralleled in the lies against Mao and possibly in the lies against the Kim family in North Korea. So, Stalin is powerful because his image, his legacy, his reputation, it was a lasting legacy that was it was almost like a spit in the face of the capitalist world. And I think that's why we honor him so much. He was extremely smart and he really fought for the people, and he fought against the imperialists and he won.
For real, well said, Comrade Nick. And what about you, compañero Ernesto?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with compañero Nick, but I think that's completely true. Stalin, shows us, basically shows us what worked, and showed, and wrote down that path. And I also think, and I would insist, all the compañeras watching, that are, probably, trying to understand this a little bit more, and, living in the United States, people tend, and obviously because of where we live, but people tend to have this idea that, all these forces throughout history that have shaped the world don't exist in the United States. When you read, Stalin, or when you read, basically theory, but in this case, Stalin and the national question, you'll make so much connections that it'll completely change the course of your ideas and your mentality. And you'll see, how these forces are very much alive and well, not only today, but even within the United States themselves, what is currently called the United States. So, I mean, I would just, support, all the compas out there watching, and to, if they haven't, already read, Stalin or, other compañeros, read them. You'll learn so much, and it'll help you understand the world much, much better, right? And I think, that's proven, just like compañero Nick said, I mean, if it wasn't true, there wouldn't be so much crazy stuff put out there about Stalin, that he ate 5 million babies and kicked 2,000 puppies and who knows what else.
Right.
The craziest stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's just, it's very important that we study.
Yeah, well said, Comrade Ernesto. There's so many lies about Stalin out there, including from the left. I mean, that's the crazy part, is that, like, when I was first getting into socialism and communism and I started researching Stalin, like, I would go to Barnes and Noble or Borders at the time, which existed back then, and I would try to get every book that was out there about socialism and communism. And I noticed, I'm like, why are all these books talking shit about Stalin and the Soviet Union? And I'm like, there's a pattern here, and it's interesting because it relates to the dominant trend within the left, where you have Trotsky's line of permanent revolution, which in theory, it sounds revolutionary, but in essence, what it really boils down to is this idea that we have to wait for Europe to have a revolution, right? Because at the time, you had Imperial Russia and what was the Soviet Union that was underdeveloped, feudal, it didn't have factories, it didn't have development. And so Trotsky was saying we have to wait for England and Germany to develop, and from there have a permanent revolution worldwide in Europe, and then Russia, we have to wait. But Stalin was a proponent of socialism in one country, which is the idea that we can start to build socialism here in Russia and Georgia and other areas in the global south without having to depend on Germany and England, because the conditions were better in England, Germany. The labor aristocracy was more advanced. The liberals were able to offer more concessions. And we see that even playing out today with people who are quote unquote socialists, who are shilling for Biden and who are saying, oh, well, this is the revolution. We're going to support Biden. And then all of a sudden they're quiet. And so it's very relevant to today and talking about the labor aristocracy. And so let's just jump right into it. There's two main parts to the essay. And so I'm just going to read the first part and then get responses from the compañeros here, and we'll discuss it a bit. And so again, this is The National Question, an essay from the Foundations of Leninism. Great book. I highly suggest everybody read it. It's very essential. By the way, you're not going to find this in Barnes & Noble. You're not going to find this at your hipster coffee shop, in the gentrified neighborhood. This is something that is online for free. Thankfully, Marxist.org, shout out to them. But I suggest y'all take a look. So jumping right into it, the national question. From this theme, I take two main questions. A, the presentation of the question, and B, the liberation movement of the oppressed peoples and the proletarian revolution. So we'll go into the first one. The presentation of the question. During the last 2 decades, the national question has undergone a number of very important changes. The national question in the period of the Second International and the national question in the period of Leninism are far from being the same thing. They differ profoundly from each other, not only in their scope, but also in their intrinsic character. Formerly, the national question was usually confined to a narrow circle of questions concerning primarily, quote, civilized nationalities, the Irish, the Hungarians, the Poles, the Finns, the Serbs, and several other European nationalities. That was the circle of unequal peoples in whose destinies the leaders of the Second International were interested. The scores and hundreds of millions of Asiatic and African peoples who are suffering national oppression in its most savage and cruel form usually remained outside of their field of vision. They hesitated to put white and black, quote, civilized and, quote, uncivilized on the same plane. 2 or 3 meaningless, lukewarm resolutions, which carefully evaded the question of liberating the colonies. That was all the leaders of the Second International could boast of. Now we can say that this duplicity and half-heartedness in dealing with the national question has been brought to an end. Leninism laid bare this crying incongruity, broke down the wall between whites and blacks, between European and Asiatics, between the civilized and the uncivilized, slaves of imperialism, and thus linked the national question with the question of the colonies. The national question was thereby transformed from a particular and internal state problem into a general and international problem, into a world problem of emancipating the oppressed peoples in the dependent countries and colonies from the yoke of imperialism. Formerly, the principle of self-determination of nations was usually misinterpreted, and not infrequently it was narrowed down to the idea of the right of nations to autonomy. Certain leaders of the Second International went so far as to turn the right to self-determination into the right to cultural autonomy, i.e., the right of oppressed nations to have their own cultural institutions, leaving all political power in the hands of the ruling nation. As a consequence, the idea of self-determination stood in danger of being transformed from an instrument for combating annexations into an instrument for justifying them. Now we can say that this confusion has been cleared up. Leninism broadened the conception of self-determinism, interpreting it as the right of oppressed peoples of the dependent countries and colonies to complete secession, as the right of nations to independent existence as states. This precluded the possibility of justifying annexations by interpreting the right to self-determinism as the right to autonomy. Thus, the principle of self-determinism itself was transformed from an instrument for deceiving the masses, which undoubtedly was in the hands of the social chauvinists during the imperialist war, into an instrument for exposing all imperialist aspirations and chauvinist machinations, into an instrument for the political education of the masses in the spirit of internationalism. Formerly, the question of the oppressed nations was usually regarded as purely a juridical question. Solemn proclamations about, quote, national equality of rights, innumerable declarations about the, quote, equality of nations, that was the stock in trade of the parties of the Second International, which glossed over the fact that equality of nations under imperialism, where one group of nations, a minority, lives by exploiting another group of nations, is sheer mockery of the oppressed nations. Now we can say that this bourgeois juridical point of view on the national question has been exposed. Leninism brought the national question down from the lofty heights of high-sounding declarations to solid ground and declared that pronouncements about the, quote, equality of nations, not backed by the direct support of the proletarian parties for the liberation struggle of the oppressed nations, are meaningless and false. In this way, the question of the oppressed nations becomes one of supporting the oppressed nations, of rendering real and continuous assistance to them in their struggle against imperialism for real equality of nations, for their independent existence as states. Formerly, the national question was regarded from a reformist point of view, as an independent question having no connection with the general question of the power of capital, of the overthrow of imperialism, of proletarian revolution. It was tacitly assumed that the victory of the proletariat in Europe was possible without a direct alliance with the liberation movements in the colonies, that the national colonial question could be solved on the quiet, quote, of its own accord off the highway of the proletarian revolution, without a revolutionary struggle against imperialism. Now we can say that anti-revolutionary point of view has been exposed. Leninism has proved, and the imperialist war and the revolution in Russia has confirmed, that the national question can be solved only in connection with and on the basis of the proletarian revolution, and that the road to victory of the revolution in the West lies through the revolutionary alliance with the liberation movement of the colonies and dependent countries against imperialism. The national question is part of the general question of the proletarian revolution, a part of the question of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The question is as follows: are the revolutionary potentialities latent in the revolutionary liberation movement of the oppressed countries already exhausted or not? And if not, is there any hope, any basis for utilizing these potentialities for the proletarian revolution, for transforming the dependent and colonial countries from a reserve of the imperialist bourgeoisie into a reserve of the revolutionary proletariat, into an ally of the latter? Leninism replies to this question in the affirmative, i.e., it recognizes the existence of revolutionary capacities in the national liberation movement of the oppressed countries, and the possibility of using these for overthrowing the common enemy, for overthrowing imperialism. The mechanics of the development of imperialism, the imperialist war, and the revolution in Russia wholly confirm the conclusions of Leninism on this score. Hence, the necessity for the proletariat of the, quote, dominant nations to support resolutely and actively to support the national liberation movement of the oppressed and dependent peoples. This does not mean, of course, that the proletariat must support every national movement, everywhere and always, in every individual concrete case. It means that support must be given to such national movements as tend to weaken, to overthrow imperialism, and not to strengthen and preserve it. Cases occur when the national movements in certain oppressed countries came into conflict with the interests of the development of the proletarian movement. In such cases, support is, of course, entirely out of the question. The question of the rights of nations is not an isolated, self-sufficient question. It is a part of the general problem of the proletarian revolution, subordinate to the whole, and must be considered from the point of view of the whole. In the 40s of the last century, Marx supported the national movement of the Poles and Hungarians, and was opposed to the national movement of the Czechs and the South Slavs. Why? Because the Czechs and the South Slavs were then, quote, reactionary peoples, Russian outposts in Europe, outposts of absolutism, whereas the Poles and the Hungarians were, quote, revolutionary peoples fighting against absolutism. Because support of the national movement of the Czechs and the South Slavs was at that time equivalent to indirect support for Tsarism, the most dangerous enemy of the revolutionary movement in Europe. And here he quotes Lenin, the quote, the various demands of democracy, writes Lenin, including self-determination, are not an absolute, but a small part of the general democratic world movement. In individual concrete cases, the part may contradict the whole. If so, it must be rejected, unquote. Back to Stalin. This is the position in regard to the question of particular national movements, of the possible reactionary character of these movements, if, of course, they are appraised not from the formal point of view, not from the point of view of abstract rights, but concretely from the point of view of the interest of the revolutionary movement. The same must be said of the revolutionary character of national movements in general. The unquestionably revolutionary character of the vast majority of national movements is as relative and peculiar as is the possible revolutionary character of certain particular national movements. The revolutionary character of a national movement under the conditions of imperialist oppression does not necessarily presuppose the existence of proletarian elements in the movement, the existence of a revolutionary or a republican program of the movement, the existence of a democratic basis of the movement. The struggle that the Emir of Afghanistan is waging for the independence of Afghanistan is objectively a revolutionary struggle, despite the monarchist views of the Emir and his associates, for it weakens, disintegrates, and undermines imperialism. Whereas the struggle waged by such, quote, desperate Democrats and, quote, socialists, quote, revolutionaries and Republicans as, for example, Kerensky, Tsereteli, Ronaldel, Schneidman, Chernov, and Dan Henderson and Kleins during the imperialist war was a reactionary struggle, for its results was the embellishment, the strengthening, the victory of imperialism. For the same reasons, the struggle that the Egyptian merchants and bourgeois intellectuals are waging for the independence of Egypt is objectively a revolutionary struggle. Despite the bourgeois origin and bourgeois title of the leaders of Egyptian national movement, despite the fact that they are opposed to socialism, whereas the struggle that the British, quote, Labour government is waging to preserve Egypt's dependent position is for the same reason a reactionary struggle, despite the proletarian origin and the proletarian title of the members of the government, despite the fact that they are, quote, for socialism. There is no need to mention the national movement in other larger colonial dependent countries, such as India and China, every step of which along the road to liberation, even if it runs counter to the demands of formal democracy, is a steam hammer blow at imperialism. is undoubtedly a revolutionary step. Lenin was right in saying that the national movement of the oppressed countries should be appraised not from the point of view of formal democracy, but from the point of view of the actual results, as shown by the general balance sheet of struggle against imperialism. That is to say, quote, not in isolation, but on a world scale. So that was part one of Lenin's The National Question, the essay from the Foundations of Leninism. Comrade Ernesto, what do you think about that excerpt?
I mean, I think that excerpt, if we put it into context of the world we live in the United States, it helps clear up a lot. If we look at the history of the United States, it's not necessarily, like one whole history of a nation developing or whatever. It's the history of submitting different nations to the will of the settlers. Beginning with some of our people, the different native nations, then bringing Africans as slaves, and out of that you had another nation develop, and then finally over here in the Southwest, what we call Aztlán, the invasion of Mexico, and then the theft of lands from Mexicanos and different native nations. So I think this section really helps put that in context, because I think a lot of people don't understand. People that don't read this or which whatever it may be. But as a Chicano, I'll speak as a Chicano, ¿verdad? I mean, we have a history and a claim, a historical claim, economic claim, all these claims to basically a fourth of the land that is occupied by the greatest empire on earth. Having a movement that would challenge, that hegemony, basically challenge that empire on territory, that would be a deafening blow to imperialism. We had, all this, Raza here in the Southwest, and wherever there's Raza, we call Raza, Chicanos, Mexicanos, or, Latinos and other native people, if we were to, once we have that revolutionary national consciousness, more founded, this section clearly shows us, what that really means. That means this movement, can again, it could be a huge blow to imperialism. I mean, that's one fourth of the empire, the territory that it occupies, and I think, it's funny because they know this. The United States knows this. It knows the potential that we have here in the Southwest. They've even written about it. If you see some of the rhetoric that has come out, a lot of stuff came out, in the early 2000s, way before Trump and all that. But a lot of that rhetoric, racist rhetoric coming from the right, and was basically saying that, that the Southwest is losing its Americanness, it's changing in all this, in character, which really it's just returning to what it was, and it's been a part. I mean, in my opinion, it's been a part of Latino America and Native America, which is something that they just want to deny. I mean, the names of places, the people, the character, it's all there. It's the gringos that came and tried to change everything. But my point being is that there's this section here is clearly saying that, and showing us how it's not the first time this has happened. It's happened before in history, and we should learn from it. So I think that's something I took greatly from this section.
Yeah, that's a great point, Comrade Ernesto. And I think it's good to really mention that what you said is really important, that the U.S. imperialists are scared of Aztlán, of the occupied territories belonging to Chicano, Mexican, indigenous peoples being liberated, joining Latin America. Can you imagine the reaction from the U.S. if Aztlán reunited with Mexico and started trading with Latin America, joined ALBA, started trading with, with Venezuela, with Cuba, with La Matria Grande, and overnight, I think the U.S. economy was shut down because one joke that me and Ofelia, shout out to Ofelia, my girlfriend, and also co-editor of ANTICONQUISTA, y'all have probably seen that logo and slogan by Dunkin' Donuts that says "America runs on America runs on Dunkin'." So we switched it up and we said America runs on compas, right? Compas are the immigrant workers, the homies who are up the earliest. They go up to the businesses, they open up everything, they cook everything, they run the economy, right? But they're hidden, they're in the shadows, while the white masters, the white capitalists run and control everything. If we were to work together to shut down the U.S. economy overnight, everything will be shut down. Especially here in the Southwest. I'm out here in LA. Overnight, it will be shut down, and so the power is with the oppressed nationalities. And even though people who, not everybody who is identified as Chicano or in the Chicano movement is necessarily socialist. Objectively, a liberation movement of Chicano people and Mexican people in the Southwest would be a revolutionary because it would overthrow the U.S. imperialist system. It would take it by its root. And the same thing with Puerto Rico as well, And so, Nick, Comrade Nick, just kind of following up with you, what do you think about that first excerpt and your response to it?
Yeah, I thought it was good. I like the very first sort of paragraph Stalin has where he talks about how a lot of the European Marxists and those Marxist parties were acknowledging that the national question was for civilized nations like the Finns or the Serbs or the Hungarians or the Poles, but they weren't acknowledging that for African, Asian, Latin American countries that there was also a national question to be asked there. Right, but they didn't even care about that because those were all of their colonies at the time. It reminds me a lot of what was going on. I think a couple of years ago, a big thing people talk about is the Catalan independence movement, and I think that's cool. It's cool if Catalan gets independence because it will hurt imperialism. But why do we have Americans like U.S. Marxists talking about Catalan independence when you have Puerto Rico as a colony, when you have Aztlán, when you have black colonized folks living in the South who are getting shot and killed every day? You have national liberation movements right here in your country that a lot of these U.S. communists, most of them white, are ignoring. And to me, it doesn't make any sense. Like when we talk about national liberation movements, this should be the first thing that any Communist Party in the United States addresses: national liberation. Because what do you want to do? You want to start a socialist state in the United States. But what are you going to do with Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, the Southwest, the southern Black Belt region of the country? You're going to just what they plan on doing is having a socialist revolution and annexing those regions. I think it's talked about a little bit at some point in the reading, but it's like they want to create cultural institutions for us as like reforms just to appease people, but they don't want to actually give up political power. And they did that in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, they had the flag of Grito de Lares was banned, right? And they eventually took off the ban. They allow you to wave the flag, but they didn't give up any political power. They allow us to have some revolutionaries. They let them free. Fine, okay, great. But they didn't give us any political power. And they do the same with every oppressed nationality in this country. And I think the Stalin's work, he really touches on that. Like the imperialists will do all these other things to try to make it seem like they're working with the people, right? But they don't actually care to actually give up any of that power for the people. All they care about is keeping power and making it seem like they have like these cultural institutions or cultural reforms just to appease a lot of the colonized masses. And that's not going to cut it, because at the end of the day, we're still going to be facing that same racism. We're still going to be facing that same exploitation and imperialism, because you see us as lesser, as uncivilized individuals.
Yeah, that's a great point, Comrade Nick. Well said. And I think that it really connects to bigger problems in the left today. I mean, there's so many people who talk about like building socialism in the United States and building a new socialist system here. But it's like, wait a second, before we even get to that, like you said, we have to address the fact that the Southwest, we have to address the fact that all these lands were stolen from Mexico, from indigenous people, that African people in the Southeast, in what we could call New Africa, are still enslaved and occupied on their lands. And same thing with indigenous peoples all over. And that's something that we have to fundamentally address. And I'm glad in that first section of the essay, Stalin really tackles the difference between appearance and essence. And it's something that it's central to Marxist dialectics as well, is there's a difference between the appearance of a thing and the essence of a thing. And I think this is something that so many people in the first world left fail to understand dialectically, where so many people get caught up in labels, right? They're like, they think of it as like Wikipedia or just labels. They're like, okay, so what is that party? You're Marxist-Leninist? Are you Marxist-Leninist Maoist? Are you Trotsky? Like, they're so caught up in these labels without understanding what they do in essence in real life. And something can have a revolutionary sounding name in appearance, but in essence, it's reactionary as fuck. And I think a good example of that was the Labor Party that Stalin mentioned in this essay, where he says, even though, okay, they have the name labor in their party's name, and they are quote unquote for workers' rights, they're supporting imperialism. Look at Tony Blair. You know, he was in the Labor Party. He supported the invasion of Iraq. He supported the US imperialist invasion. The Labor Party has played a major role in advancing imperialism, even though in appearance it has a revolutionary sounding name, the Labor Party. In essence, it is reactionary. And then dialectically, we can flip that as well, where with the example of the Emirate of Afghanistan, where in appearance, you hear the Emirate of Afghanistan and like Sharia law, you're kind of like, oh shit, like, you know, you're kind of like, okay, I'm a socialist, that's different. But in essence, they're tackling colonialism, they're tackling imperialism because they're seeking independence from an imperialist force. And it's ultimately up to the people of Afghanistan to decide what they want. They know what system they want. It's not up to some random weird white leftists in the first world to be like, oh, that's incorrect. Like you should adopt this system. No, they know what they want. And I think a great example today is Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, for example. So many people on the left, like we Anticonquista, you know, we have solidarity with the peoples of Iran against imperialism. And we get a lot of shit for that because there's so many people in the white first row left who are like, you know, Iran's not socialist, right? You know, they're Muslim, right? I'm like, yeah, okay, but they're trading with Venezuela, they're trading with Cuba, they're trading with Nicaragua, with Bolivia. They're never invaded any of our countries, right? They know what they want to have. If they want to have an Islamic Shia Muslim government, that's up to them to decide. And objectively, in essence, they're combating imperialism. They're creating an alternative. They're trading with China and Russia, the Belt and Road Initiative. They're helping the Ansar Allah movement in Yemen. You know what I'm saying? And so it's like people have to get past these false labels that they're so stuck on. You know, they're like, are you socialist? Are you and it's like, look at the appearance and essence. And I think it's one of those gems of dialectical materialism that are embedded within this essay by Stalin. So let's move on to part two of this essay. Not much left on it. I think this is where it kind of picks up and it gets really interesting. Shout out, by the way, shout out to everybody in the chat. Shout out to Angel, Cali Money, Lacerda, to Freeman, to the compas in Puerto Rico and Aslan, who are watching and listening to this all over the global South. We got to study and come together and really analyze this, because the lies that we're getting from mainstream media, from even mainstream books about socialism, we're never going to hear this about Stalin. And so part two of the national question from the Foundations of Leninism, Stalin says, quote, the liberation movement of the oppressed peoples and the proletarian revolution. In solving the national question, Leninism proceeds from the following theses. A, the world is divided into two camps, the camp of a handful of civilized nations which possess finance, capital, and exploit the vast majority of the population of the globe, and the camp of the oppressed and exploited peoples in the colonies and dependent countries which constitute the majority. B, the colonies and the dependent countries oppressed and exploited by finance capital constitute a vast reserve and a very important source of strength for imperialism. C, the revolutionary struggle of the oppressed peoples in the dependent and colonial countries against imperialism is the only road that leads to their emancipation from oppression and exploitation. D, the most important colonial and dependent countries have already taken the path of the national liberation movement, which cannot but lead to the crisis of world capitalism. E, The interests of the proletarian movement in the developed countries and of the national liberation movement in the colonies call for the union of these two forms of the revolutionary movement into a common front against the common enemy, against imperialism. F. The victory of the working class in the developed countries and the liberation of oppressed peoples from the yoke of imperialism are impossible without the formation and consolidation of a common revolutionary front. G. The formation of a common revolutionary front is impossible unless the proletariat of the oppressor nations renders direct and determined support to the liberation movement of the oppressed peoples against the imperialism of its, quote, own country. For, quote, no nation can be free if it oppresses others. And there he's quoting Engels. H. This support implies the upholding, defense, and implementation of the slogan of the right of nations to secession, to independent existence as states. I. Unless the slogan is implemented, the union and collaboration of nations within a single world economic system, which is the material basis for the victory of world socialism, cannot be brought about. And J. This union can only be voluntary, arising on the basis of mutual confidence and fraternal relations among peoples. Hence, the two sides, the two tendencies of the national question: the tendency towards political emancipation from the shackles of imperialism and towards the formation of an independent national state, a tendency which arose as a consequence of imperialist suppression and colonial exploitation, and the tendency towards closer economic relations among nations, which arose as a result of the formation of the world market and a world economic system. And here he's quoting Lenin. Developing capitalism, says Lenin, knows two historical tendencies in the national question. First, the awakening of national life and national movements, struggle against all national oppression, creation of national states. Second, development and acceleration of all kinds of intercourse between nations, breakdown of national barriers, creation of the international unity of capital, of economic life in general, of politics, science, etc. Both tendencies are a worldwide law of capitalism. The first predominates at the beginning of its development. The second characterizes mature capitalism that is moving towards its transformation into socialist society. Back to Stalin. For imperialism, these two tendencies represent irreconcilable contradictions, because imperialism cannot exist without exploiting colonies and forcibly retaining them within the framework of the integral whole. Because imperialism can bring nations together only by means of annexations and colonial conquest, without which imperialism is, generally speaking, inconceivable. For communism, on the contrary, these tendencies are but two sides of a single cause, the cause of the emancipation of the oppressed people from the yoke of imperialism, because communism knows that the union of peoples in a single world economic system is possible only in the basis of mutual confidence and voluntary agreement, and that the road to the formation of a voluntary union of peoples lies through the separation of the colonies from the, quote, integral imperialist whole, through the transformation of the colonies into independent states. Hence the necessity for a stubborn, continuous, and determined struggle against the dominant nation chauvinism of the, quote, socialist ruling nations, Britain, France, America, Italy, Japan, etc., who do not want to fight their imperialist governments, who do not want to support the struggle of the oppressed peoples in, quote, their colonies for emancipation from oppression, for secession. Without such a struggle, the education of the working class of the ruling nations in the spirit of true internationalism, in the spirit of closer relations with the toiling masses of the dependent countries and colonies, in the spirit of real preparation for the proletarian revolution, is inconceivable. The revolution would not have been victorious in Russia, and the Kolchak and Denikin would not have been crushed had not the Russian proletariat enjoyed the sympathy and support of the oppressed peoples of the former Russian Empire. But to win the sympathy and support of these peoples, it had first of all to break the fetters of Russian imperialism and free these people from the yoke of national oppression. Without this, it would have been impossible to consolidate Soviet power, to implement real internationalism, and create that remarkable organization for the collaboration of peoples, which is called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and which is the living prototype of the future union of peoples in a single world economic system. Hence the necessity of fighting against the national isolationism, narrowness, and aloofness of the socialists in the oppressed countries, who do not want to rise above their national parochialism and do not understand the connection between the liberation movement in their own countries and the proletarian movement in the ruling countries. Without such a struggle, it is inconceivable that the proletariat of the oppressed nations can maintain an independent policy and its class solidarity with the proletariat of the ruling countries in the fight for the overthrow of the common enemy, in the fight for the overthrow of imperialism. Without such a struggle, internationalism would be impossible. Such is the way in which the toiling masses of the dominant and of the oppressed nations must be educated in the spirit of revolutionary internationalism. Here's what Lenin says about this twofold task of communism in educating the workers in the spirit of internationalism. And here he's quoting Lenin. Can such education be concretely identical in great oppressing nations and in small oppressed nations, in annexing nations and in annexed nations? Obviously not. The way to the one goal, to complete equality, to the closest relations and the subsequent amalgamation of all nations, obviously proceeds here by different routes in each concrete case. In the same way, let us say, as the route to a point in the middle of a given page leads towards the left from one edge and towards the right from the opposite edge. If a social democrat belonging to a great oppressing annexing nation, while advocating the amalgamation of nations in general, were to forget for even one moment that, quote, his Nicholas II, quote, his Wilhelm, George, Poincare, etc., also stands for amalgamation with small nations by means of annexations, Nicholas II being for, quote, amalgamation with Galicia, Wilhelm II for, quote, amalgamation with Belgium, etc., such a social democrat would be a ridiculous doctrinaire in theory and a abettor of imperialism in practice. The weight of emphasis in the internationalist education of the workers in the oppressing countries must necessarily consist in their advocating and upholding freedom of secession for oppressed countries. Without this, there can be no internationalism. It is our right and our duty to treat every social democrat of an oppressing nation who fails to conduct such propaganda as an imperialist, as a scoundrel. This is an absolute demand. Even if the chance of secession being possible and, quote, feasible before the introduction of socialism be 1 in 1,000. On the other hand, a social democrat belonging to a small nation must emphasize in his agitation the second word of our general formula, voluntary union of nations. He may, without violating his duties as an internationalist, be in favor of either the political independence of his nation or its inclusion in a neighboring state, XYZ, etc. But in all cases, he must fight against small nation narrow-mindedness, isolationism, and aloofness. He must recognize the fight for the recognition of the whole and the general, for the subordination of the interests of the particular to the interests of the general. People who have not gone thoroughly into the question think there is a, quote, contradiction in social democrats of oppressing nations insisting on, quote, freedom of secession, while social democrats of oppressed nations insist on, quote, freedom of union. However, a little reflection will show that there is not and cannot be any other road leading from the given situation to internationalism and the amalgamation of nations, any other road to this goal. So that was the national question, Stalin. We just finished reading the essay from the Foundations of Leninism. Shout out to Marxist.org for providing that for free online. Going to you, compañero Ernesto, what do you think of that excerpt?
Again, you know, it makes me think so much about everything we see happening in the United States. You know, like, for example, you know, first of all, it reminded me of, and what compañeros said earlier, you know, it reminded me of something my own father used to tell me when they would have discussions with, you know, different white left organizations, and they would tell them, if you're really a communist, you would support us. You know, actual communists would support the Chicano liberation struggle, you know, and obviously, you know, all the other liberation struggles of, you know, our Boricua compañeros, Native nations, Africans, within, you know, the U.S. or you know, right, in our continent, which they don't, or they make some sort of, half-winded, kind of appeasing thing, because that even reminds me of how, some of these organizations, they attack, they attack, for example, they've attacked Raza Unida, they've attacked Unión, they've attacked like Mecha, different Chicano, different expressions from our own movimiento, and saying, oh, you guys are just narrow nationalists and this and that. We're internationalists. And they claim to be internationalists, but they only, they have, the people leading their organization are all white, and the people getting, beat up or arrested at the events are all the Raza and Africans and Asian sisters and brothers, and on the other side, it's, us, the Chicanos, for example, as a member of La Raza Unida, growing up in the Raza Unida, I remember all the time, we would have events and with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And I remember people, representatives from the Irish Liberation Struggle, from the INLA, Irish National Liberation Army or Party, the party, not the army wasn't there. They would be there. You would have people from AIM and other organizations. You have people from, representing Puerto Rico, and obviously African, the AAPRP, and other groups. So we're showing this actual international solidarity. Because we understand, what this means. We understand, that our struggle for national liberation is part of something much bigger, and it helps advance the struggle for socialism and ultimately communism. That's true internationalism, and it even reminds me, that's why that clip you put at the beginning was so beautiful, because I actually went to Cuba in 2002. And I went with my dad and my sister, because, we were like, well, let's check this out, man, see how it is actually. And it was the most beautiful thing. We went for May 1st, Dia del Trabajador. It was the most beautiful thing, and we sang the International and we sang the Cuban national anthem. And there was people from all over the world together with, probably most of La Habana, singing, waving their flags and everything. It was the most beautiful thing, you can't get more international than that, So, and there we are, we didn't go as Raza Unida members, but we are Raza Unida members, and there we were. It was beautiful, to stand there with people from all over the world in one struggle, and not, and not downplaying any of our struggles, So it reminded me of that, and it all, if people would actually read this, it would. And it would clarify a lot of misconceptions they have, and a lot of propaganda they've been fed, even like you said, even from quote unquote the left, that have fed some of that propaganda to organizers and activists and the general left circles, and even it reminded me of how you also mentioned the essence, how things appear in the essence of them, that was one of the struggles that we had, and, probably compañero Matt and Karina told you, but already, but like when the MEPA came out, in the MEPA, there was a whole struggle, when 2 years ago, Mecha with the student group, Mecha, a historic Chicano student group, had their 50th conference, and there was this push within Mecha to change the name. Because, and like you said, they brought out all these radical sounding terms and decolonial and counter hegemonic, saber qué, yeah. All these other things. And in essence, what were they doing? They were helping to destroy, the national liberal. I mean, even if, like you said, even if the compañeros in Mecha, aren't, all socialists or revolutionary nationalists, but they were part of Mecha, and so they helped, so they were upholding, or organically these ideas of being Chicano and Aztlán, so in the liberation struggle, they've been upholding that for 50 years, as students and young people mostly, so the MEPA, with all their radical sounding rhetoric, they tried to do a number against, this national liberation struggle in the Southwest. And I mean, they ultimately failed, but they did, you know, they did hurt the movimiento, you know. But you know, I just, you know, that you know, all this reminds me of that. You know, it reminds you how we could apply this, you know, to our current reality, you know, and it just makes total sense, you know, and even like what compañero said, Nick, you know, you have and we've always seen this, you know, it's so ironic, and you know, I just don't get it, you know, how you have, you know, these white leftists, and unfortunately some of our own people who are in those circles, they're like, oh yeah, you know, the Vascos and Catalan, Palestina, and total support for Palestina, total support for, you know, the Vascos and Catalan, 100%, you know. But what about here? What about our struggle? What about you know, when you go back home and you're with your family, you know, you're with an oppressed nation right there, you know, in your barrio or your neighborhood or wherever. What about us? You know, just forgetting what we're supposed to do here. You know, I mean, and sometimes, you know, I know that probably gets a little scary for people, because when you admit that, you admit, well, there's a whole lot of work and there's a lot of challenging things you have to admit to when you admit to, you know, well, we have a whole liberation struggles within the Valley of the Beast, you know, as you know, Boricuas, as Chicanos, as, you know, indigenous people or Africanos, etc. You know, so yeah, I mean, again, you know, it just helps understand and apply some of these lessons already learned, you know, probably over 100 years ago already, to our current situation, you know, and not, you know, not copying anything as the word for word or anything like that, you know, but, you know, the basic foundation, the basic understanding of this phenomenon, you know.
Yeah, well said, compañero Ernesto. And Nick, what did you think about that last excerpt of the essay?
Yeah, I think Ernesto, I think what he said was really put it really well. I really like the part where, you know, you're talking about we are the internationalists. A lot of people try to make it seem like our movement is all about ourselves or like our own ethnicities, or like we want to create some sort of ethno state or something. But that's not what we're trying to do. We're working with people all across the globe, and we're acknowledging, you know, we acknowledge we have indigenous ancestry. We acknowledge we have African ancestry. We acknowledge all of our ancestry and where we come from and who we need to work with to make something happen. And I think too, one of the most important parts of this section, I want to go back to where he's listing off the letters, part G, where he says the formation of a common revolutionary front is impossible unless the proletariat of the oppressor nations renders direct and determined support to the liberation movement of the oppressed peoples against the imperialism of its own country. To me, what that sounds like is, if you want true freedom and true liberation here in the US, as a US worker, you have to support the liberation movements of other countries. There's no other way. Otherwise, you're not actually free. You're not actually supporting liberation movements, and you're never going to be able to liberate yourself in this country. So, you know, for a lot of like we talk about the white Marxists, and like the comrade said, not just the white Marxists, but also some of our own people. You know, you talk to some like Boricuas or Chicanos or like any Latinos, and some of them just go right along with whatever Communist Party, you know, mostly white-led Communist Party they're part of. But for a lot of these folks, they got to understand that, okay, you want freedom for the U.S. worker. Well, then you need to fight for the freedom of the Chicano in the Southwest. You need to fight for the freedom of the Black folks in the South, or the freedom of the Boricuas on the island, right? And without that, there's not gonna be any freedom or liberatory struggle here in the U.S. What it's gonna be is just a cycle of oppression and exploitation, and they're gonna just change who their focus is, you know. But I think what Comrade Ernesto said was put really well. It was really beautiful. You know, in Cuba, you get to see, I think, like you see firsthand the internationalism that exists. I remember when I went there, it was like the same experience and feeling I had. You know, people. You talk to anyone on the street, and they can give you a history, like a deep political history of their own country and the world around them, and how imperialism works. You come to the U.S., and even our folks sometimes don't even have that history, and it's not necessarily their fault, but they don't have that history. They never were taught that way. They're never even taught to think that way, you know. But understanding our struggles, understanding that we, first of all, understanding that we have colonized people in the U.S., and that having colonized people requires national liberation struggle, that right there is an important step that I think all communists in the United States need to make. That's the first step that they need to wake up to and acknowledge in order for them to even begin any sort of actions or organizing or whatever they're trying to do in this country. Because once they acknowledge that, then they'll have a path to guide them. Like what do we have to do to start this movement? What do we got to do to start this revolution? Okay, we have to acknowledge that there are national liberation struggles right here, right now that we got to support.
Most definitely. And shout out to everybody in the chat, by the way. Shout out to Orlando, Cali Money, to Red. A lot of great comments in there in the chat. One thing that is interesting, everything you all said is so on point. And just to kind of add to the discussion as well, talking about our experiences as people from oppressed nationalities and connecting it with Stalin, I'm also glad that Stalin also, while he on the one hand says that it's right for oppressed nations to push for their self-determination, to have national liberation movements, I'm also glad that he talks about the nation state not in a permanent metaphysical way, but as a transitory stage toward the end goal. Because I think that that's also one problem I've seen in the left as well with different oppressed nationalities, is that people get kind of stuck in their silos, right? And so, for example, like I was born and raised in New York, right? And born and raised in New York, one of the things that I was very active in the Honduran solidarity movement against the right-wing coup d'etat in 2009. And it was cool because we were organizing protests. We were protesting the U.S. Embassy. We were protesting, the United Nations. We were protesting like all these U.S. corporations. And it was great. But on the one hand, I was like, yo, why aren't we linking up with other Latin American groups that are doing the same thing, that are protesting the same companies, the same corporations? You know, for example, let's talk about a corporation like United Fruit, right? Or Chiquita Banana, that has operations in all of our countries here. You know, they have plantations in Central America, in Mexico, in the Caribbean, and Puerto Rico, DR. Like, imagine if the people from all those countries came together, organized a campaign against United Fruit, against all these corporations to stop them, to put an end to their imperialism. Imagine if all the Latinos in the U.S. organize a protest or a strike against the U.S. In solidarity with Venezuela and the sanctions, or in solidarity with Cuba. And I'm really glad that Stalin is able to say, okay, yeah, it's fine to have your national liberation movements, and that's the key toward overthrowing imperialism. But we also have to keep advancing further what he talks about, the intercourse of nations, right? The transcending beyond the nation state mentality, and learning about other countries, learning about their struggles, interacting. And that's what I think is really beautiful about Cuba, is that they don't just stop at Cuba, right? They're not just saying, okay, we're for Cuban liberation, that's it, who gives a fuck about everybody else? They, like you said, Nick, they actively know about Vietnam, they know about DPRK, you know, they're connected with all these movements abroad, and they're forming new nation state boundaries, they're forming new entities. And that was one of the brilliant things about the Soviet Union, is that they weren't just Russians, they weren't just Georgians or Ukrainian, they were Soviets. And it was the Soviets who defeated the Nazis, people from Russia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Some of the biggest snipers that killed the most Nazis were from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Ukraine. And it's just beautiful to see that. And I think that's something that's missing in the left today, is like we've kind of reverted back to our respective nation state borders without keeping the eye on the prize of internationalism, of uniting, of creating new entities. And even that's why you see on our logo right now, for those of y'all who are watching this, if you see our logo for ANTICONQUISTA, there's no borders on that map of Latin America. It's one entity, one patria grande, one matria grande, nuestra America, you know, that Jose Marti talks about. And Aslan, we should probably edit it to add Aslan in there as well, but it's part of that as well. You know what I'm saying? That's one entity, and we have to work as one, because that's the whole concept as well of a star, right? You have the 5-pointed star, the 5 fingers of the hand. If each finger is doing its own thing, it's weaker. But if those 5 fingers come together as a fist, it's way more powerful. You can defeat the enemy in one hit if we work as one unit. And I think that's something that Stalin is also hinting at in his essay, where we have to support national liberation as oppressed nations, but we also have to come together, work together, and build new entities like the Soviet Union in Latin America, I would love to see a union of socialist republics of Latin America. In Africa, something what Gaddafi was trying to do, create a united African union to defeat. Imagine if Africa came together as one entity, as one union to confront the Europeans. That would be something really beautiful to see. But I'm just kind of wrapping up here, passing it back to compañero Ernesto. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the work that you do with La Raza Unida, Tele-Jaguar, and where do you see the Chicano liberation movement today? Hold on, let me unmute you. There we go.
Thank you. Yeah, La Raza Unida, well, it has a pretty long history. It started basically back in the late 60s. It was like a reaction to, Chicanos that, they saw, obviously, the two major bourgeois colonial political parties. Obviously, they don't serve our interests. So, people decided, to organize our own third Chicano party. Part of the history is, mostly well known, what happened in Texas, because they actually won. There was one place called Cristal City. They swept the elections. Like this little town, this little rural, Chicano, Mexicano town. But they the right wing, the state, clamped down on them. It harassed a lot of people. Jailed some people, and one of the leaders, Jose Angel, he had to escape to Mexico because he couldn't function anymore here. He was blacklisted basically. But there was different efforts throughout, throughout Aztlán. Here in California, my father, back then he coming out of the army, and he got involved with first Mecha, and then he said the place he registered as Raza Unida Party was at the Chicano Moratorium itself. That was the historic march in East LA. It was the largest non-white march against the U.S. invasion of Vietnam. And it ended in bloodshed. We had some martyrs on that day, ¿verdad? Rubén Salazar, Lin Ward, Angel Diaz. And, my father was there, but that's where he registered Raza Unida. And, there was a lot of movimiento around there. The Raza Unida Party, also Corky Gonzalez became one of the leaders within La Raza Unida Party. Corky Gonzalez was he was a revolutionary nationalist, basically. He wrote this epic poem that, is famous among the Raza, among Chicanos, called Yo Soy Joaquin. He wrote, a few papers and stuff, gave like a lot of speeches. So there was two factions, basically. There was the people that were more reformist, with Jose Angel. They thought, we could become a power block and this and that and just register people to vote. And then there was the people with the camp with Corky, who said, we need to form our own partido, but we also need to, develop our own ideology. And ultimately the side that Corky, led is the side that won. And that's the side that continued organizing La Raza Unida Party. I say that because, a lot of history, if, people look up La Raza Unida Party online, they'll find some of the stuff that we've done contemporarily, but most of the history, even in the books, most of it is like ends it at 1975 or 73 or whatever, and Raza Unida Party went beyond that. The Chicano movement itself went beyond that. And so, we're a Chicano Raza revolutionary nationalist party led by scientific socialism, where we believe in the complete liberation of Aztlán and Raza everywhere, and like we said throughout the talk, we obviously we believe in the advancement of socialism and the creation and towards communism, ¿verdad? También. And that our struggle as Chicanos, here in Aztlán in the Southwest is part of that whole struggle of our people in native North America and Latin America. We're part, as Chicanos, we're part of both those worlds. So yeah, we organize. We've been organizing the Partido, ¿verdad? And I think we're going on an uptick, like they say, ¿verdad? Strangely, the pandemic has caused a lot of people, I think, to have more time to think about things, and reflect on what they need to do, ¿verdad? And I think that's, it's a sad reality, but it's helped us, advance a lot of work. So, we've been doing that, locally here in where I live in San Fernando, Pacoima, Southern California, you know, we're involved with a lot of stuff, ¿verdad? We've organized youth conferences, we organize a lot of marchas and stuff like that. And in the greater LA area también, ¿verdad? And we support efforts of, you know, different organizations throughout. But yeah, Tele-Jaguar, you know, our work with Tele-Jaguar goes back to a struggle with against the MEPA, you know, and against a lot of this identitarian, postmodern type of stuff just going on.
You just triggered me, Ernesto. How dare you? Nah, I feel you. I'm glad. Shout out to Tele-Jaguar, by the way. Y'all have some really dope content. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is a big issue in the left, especially even within our oppressed communities, nationalities, deconstructing everything. Everything is about tearing down, taking down what's built. Everything is problematic. Everything is horrible. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about Tele-Jaguar and some of the work that y'all do?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, when we started, well, prior to starting, you know, is when we had, you know, the whole attack against Amecha, attack against the Chicano movement, attack against even the idea of Aslan, you know, and there was this small event, which this is like one of the reasons that alarmed me, you know, because there was a small event right in the heart of Boyle Heights, you know, which is next to East LA, which, you know, is or has been historically one of the hotbeds of the Chicano liberation struggle. And I was like, wow, there's been this event here. It was called Contra Aslan. And I was like, this cannot be happening, man. This cannot be happening. And then there's no response bias, you know, and it was alarming. It hurt, you know, it hurt to see a lot of that stuff going on, you know, and it goes back, you know, again, I mean, I think that's a perfect explanation of the essence and appearance of things. You know, you've had people running around saying, you know, these things that sound liberatory, sound revolutionary, sound radical, but their essence is destructive. Their essence only serves to uphold colonialism and imperialism. You know, that's all it does, because it you know, in my analysis, all of those ideas have helped, you know, like disarm a complete generation, you know, at least the generation up to now, you know, I've, you know, this is what I found ironic. Here in Aslan, you know, and LA is a perfect example, you know, about every 10 years, you know, when there would be, you know, like this straight up like racist legislation being passed, or, you know, racist propositions, you know, totally anti-Mexican, anti-Chicano, anti-Raza, anti-migrant stuff, you know, you had massive responses every 10 years from the Raza themselves. You know, you had, you know, for example, Proposition 187, which was, you know, in the early 90s, you know, which was a total anti-immigrant and totally wrapped in racist rhetoric, you know, proposition that was being proposed in California. You had a huge response by the Raza. You know, you had, you know, walkouts, you had sit-ins, you had mechas were everywhere. You know, there was mechas. There was even a mecha in my elementary school. You know, there was mechas in every middle school. Wherever there was Chicanos, there had to be a mecha. You know, Chicano students in the middle schools, in the high schools, in even continuation schools, in the colleges and universities, there was mechas. You know, they were everywhere. You know, the Partido, Unión del Barrio, you know, all these different organizations everywhere. You know, and you had, you know, there was this huge march that went down Cesar Chavez Avenue, Boulevard. I mean, from in East LA down to you know, like Placita and into downtown. You know, a massive, you know, response by the Raza, and, you know, people, you know, with Aslan flags, with Mexican flags, with flags from Central America, you know, with calls for, you know, liberation and this and that, you know, and that, you know, we had that happen. You know, then you had Proposition 209, the same thing, and then we had the mid early 2000s, you know, where you had the Sensenbrenner bill. That was being proposed, you know, and it passed, I think, the House. And the Sensenbrenner bill was basically like Proposition 187 on crack and national, you know. And I mean, you had such a response by our people. You know, it was so beautiful. I remember, marching in downtown LA in that massive, marcha that happened. You had people, on the sides of the buildings, with their flags from Honduras, from Guatemala, from El Salvador, Mexicano, obviously a bunch of Mexicano flags, and, once in a while an Aslan flag. And I remember shouting, we sounded like lions, because I remember shouting, Viva la Raza, and you just heard like this massive wave of voices in unison shouted, and shouting. And this was your average everyday people, your workers. This was the working class of Los Angeles, the working class of Aslan, at least a big portion of it, the Raza. You had Chicanos, obviously Chicanos there, and for many generations to, people that were probably not born here, but grew up as Chicanos. You had, everybody was out there. And so you had that response, by our community, and then when you have this total racist, anti-Mexican, anti-migrant guy get into the presidency, and it's like, that response went, because everybody was concerned with not sounding hegemonic and, all the Mexican hegemony, and Aslan is colonial, and Chicanos are inherently patriarchal. You had all this stuff going around that it weakened us. And that we didn't see that response. I mean, there was obviously, I'm not putting down the movimientos that happened. There was, a lot of great movimientos, but that grassroots response from our people, it wasn't there because we were disarmed. We were totally disarmed. And, probably the same thing happened with the other nations, with our Boricua brother. I'm not sure, it probably happened with the Boricua brothers and sisters, but, you had that this whole postmodern way of looking at reality, which makes no sense. It sounds radical, and it'll, if you don't understand things, it'll get your attention, but it leads you nowhere, and it leads you to eventually just thinking of yourself as an individual, and that's it. You don't need to be a part of an organization. You don't need to study the movements that have existed already or before. You don't need to do all that, because why should you do that? You don't need to talk about nationalism, because nationalism is colonial, and and all these things, that just don't make any sense, So out of that came, Tele-Jaguar, the compañeros, Matt, Karina, and another compañera who was with us. We talked about, well, we need to do something, to respond to all this, and to not be, if they tell us we're going to cancel you and this and that, well, so what? You cancel me, so what? In the real world, back in our communities, we're actually doing work, and you can't just cancel someone out of existence. I mean, you could, I guess. They're not going to do
that. Yeah, well said, comrade. That's beautiful. I couldn't have put it better myself. And it's funny because I live out here in Monterey Park, which is right next to East LA. And I'm Honduran. I'm probably like the only Honduran in this neighborhood, but I'm more Chicano nationalist and Mexican nationalist than some postmodern liberal Chicanos and Mexicans here who are like, oh, that's problematic, and that's, how dare you? And I'm like, no, like, viva la raza, viva Aslan, like, and I support them. They get confused because I don't buy into the whole hegemony bullshit. Our enemies on Wall Street. You know what I'm saying? Exactly. Our enemies on Wall Street and Washington, D.C., and we got to work together and unite. And just kind of wrapping up here, comrades, it's been really great to talk to y'all. Just kind of finishing up with Comrade Nick in Jersey. Where do you see the Puerto Rican liberation movement today, and what are some of the biggest struggles that the Puerto Rican people are facing today?
Well, obviously the biggest struggle is U.S. colonialism, U.S. imperialism. It was interesting to see a couple of years ago the mass movement in Puerto Rico in overthrowing the governor. That was interesting because one of the things I noticed was you had some Puerto Ricans I know who lived like right around me, who were in Puerto Rico at the time, who were participating in the movement. So you had diaspora Puerto Ricans participating in the politics of the island, which for a while there was, and for really the history of Puerto Rico, there's been a separation between and a division between the ones on the island and ones here in the States, right? And so now you have them coming together to fight a political force, a political enemy, which was U.S. imperialism and colonialism. So that was beautiful to see. And I think that one of the things with Puerto Rican independence is that's going on, and again, we also saw this in the last election, is you have more and more people who are realizing that statehood is not an option for Puerto Rico. You know, we've had how many elections on statehood, and how many times has it been ignored? Every time they vote to be a state, and every time it gets ignored. And this year, what we saw is, again, they voted for it to be a state, but they had the voter participation was significantly lower than it was in the previous years. So you could tell that people on the island they no longer, you know, they're no longer being won over by this idea, well, state or colony. They don't want either, right? They want independence. After Hurricane Maria, after what really, you know, and it's not just Donald Trump. It's a lot of U.S. presidents, but Donald Trump just made it very explicit how little he cared about Puerto Ricans, and not just Puerto Ricans, but Latinos. I mean, you know, his policies were atrocious. They were evil. And that really, I think that was a slap in the face for all Latinos. Like, look, these people don't care about us. They're not going to try to save us. They're not going to try to do anything to us, or they're not going to try to you know, lift us up like they plan to do with the white workers, or they plan to do with some people back in the States, in the mainland states. So people are being disaffected. They're disaffected with the United States. They're disaffected with U.S. imperialism and colonialism. They don't want it anymore. And I think that it is also true that, you know, there was like identity politics, and like the postmodern sort of way of thinking has damaged, I think, every movement, you know, from everything that I've seen. And, you know, I could talk about my experience as a student I was a student in California. I was about like 40 minutes outside of LA, near San Bernardino. And well, I remember when I was a student there, and I was part of like the Latino student groups. A lot of it was like acknowledging your culture, acknowledging your history, acknowledging where you're from, but not actually doing anything about, not engaging in the politics. It was all like cultural, you know, we want to celebrate our cultures, but we don't want to celebrate the movements and like the struggle that exists within our identities, the ethnicity. You know, almost no one talked about Aztlán, and most of the school was Mexican. And so that didn't make any sense to me. It was like, you know, you had, and a lot of them did, you know, granted, a lot of them did do a lot of work around, and I was part of the work with a lot of like the undocumented immigrants, and we did a lot of like helping get resources to the migrant caravan. But when it comes to actually thinking about like how does this work politically, and how can we understand this in the framework of imperialism, that work wasn't really being done. And so, you know, I think what the universities have done, and what this sort of like bourgeois ideology that exists nowadays has done, is it is sort of defeated the national liberation struggle by saying, or not defeated, but it has repressed them by saying things like compañero Ernesto was talking about, you know, trying to frame it as, well, they're colonialists, right? Well, you know, well, what about the indigenous folks that were here first? And it's like, look, these are contradictions, but it's not colonialist to say the fact that, well, this was conquered territory, right? This territory was stolen. You know, well, you know, don't you know that in Latin America, in like Chicano neighborhoods, there's racism? Aren't they anti-black? You know, like, then it became a debate about race, and then it became a debate about like sex, and it was like all of this was just a distraction around. We are colonized people, and we need to fight an anti-colonial war before we get to all these other contradictions. If we can't liberate certain folks, we can't liberate ourselves. If we can't liberate ourselves, we can't liberate anyone else in the community, right? And that a lot of that was missed or glossed over or ignored. But you know, in terms of like the Puerto Rican struggle, again, we suffered from the same problems, from the same criticism. But I think now we're seeing a bounce back. You know, now we're seeing a reinvigoration. We're seeing the fact that people are actually taking it seriously, that there needs to be a colonized struggle, there needs to be a colonial struggle, a nationalist struggle. And so, you know, I hope in the future that with all of the just blatantly imperialist things that are happening in Puerto Rico, besides the fact that they're being treated like crap by the United States, you know, the promesa, complete control of the economy in the hands of elite businessmen who don't even live on the island, you know, things like that are like so in your face. That really is what's gonna be the triggering point for a lot of the revolutionary fight and struggle that's gonna be happening in Puerto Rico, both on the island and over here too, right? But I think in order for that to happen, again, we need to go back to our history and start relearning and re-educating ourselves, or educating some people for the first time about the history, their own identities, and their struggles that they've been fighting for decades now, you know?
Yeah, most definitely. Well said, Comrade Nick. Viva Puerto Rico Libre, Viva Slan Libre. And compañero Ernesto, we definitely got to have you back, man. It was really great to speak with you. Shout out to everybody in Tele-Jaguar. Shout out to everybody with La Raza Unida. I fucked with y'all mad hard. Shout out to Comrade Nick as well. Everybody with ANTICONQUISTA, the whole ANTICONQUISTA familia, everybody in the chat. Peace out, everybody. I hope you'll have a great weekend. And thanks for joining us discussion about Stalin and the national question. Peace out, everybody.
Pa'lante.